Hello everybody, the topic I am going to explain you today is relevant to macroeconomics. At the completion of this video lecture, you will be able to know about definition of aggregate demand, components of aggregate demand, and factors that affect each of the component of aggregate demand, shape of aggregate demand curve, movement along the same demand curve, as well as shift in aggregate demand curve. Before moving forward, I would suggest to note these references for better practice and for better exam preparation. I also suggest you to see description, and description contains all of the links of my videos and they are arranged as per the syllabus. So starting with the definition of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the sum of demand by consumers, producers, government as well as exporters and importers. Components of aggregate demand include AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. AD stands for aggregate demand, C stands for consumption, I for investment, G for government expenditure, X minus M stands for net exports. X stands for exports and M for imports, while X minus M is net exports. Now coming to the basic concepts of these components and factors that affect them. Starting with consumption. Consumption refers to the day-to-day running expenditure of individuals to meet their daily expenses. For example, expenditure on fuel, food, clothing, etc. are the part of consumption. And consumption depends upon multiple factors which include income of individual, rate of interest, as well as direct taxes. For example, if income of consumer increases, he would be in the position to purchase greater quantity of goods and services, so his consumption will rise, and vice versa is true for fall in income. If income falls, consumer will be able to purchase lesser quantity of goods and services, so consumption will fall. Similarly, interest rate is also another factor that affects consumption. Interest rate is the additional amount which we have to pay when we get loan from financial institutions, and it is the additional amount which we receive from the bank if we deposit cash into the bank. However, in this situation, while we are talking about consumption, we are talking about the borrowings of an individual when he has to pay interest on loan. Whenever interest on loan is lower, consumers would be willing to get more loan from the financial institution because it is cheaper, so consumption will rise. On the other hand, if interest rate is high, then consumers think that getting loan from financial institutions is really expensive, so they will borrow less, and when they borrow less, their potential to purchase falls and their consumption will definitely fall. Direct tax is another factor that affects consumption. Direct tax is the tax which is deducted at source, like income tax. If income tax increases, then disposable income of consumer falls, and when disposable income is low, he would be able and willing to purchase lesser quantity of goods and services, so his consumption will fall. Now coming to the second component of aggregate demand, that is investment. Investment refers to the purchase of those fixed assets which result in increase in productive potential of an economy. For example, construction of new factory, purchase of new machinery and technology is the part of investment. Investment also depends upon multiple factors, and those factors include interest rate, future prospects of the business, political stability, etc. So if interest rate is low, it means investors will feel comfortable to borrow money from the financial institution, so they will borrow more money and they will invest it into the business, so investment will rise. On the other hand, if interest rate is high, investors would be reluctant to get loan from financial institutions, so investment may fall. Future prospects of the business also affect the level of investment. If businessmen are expecting future profitability, high profitability, then they will invest more into the business, and if they are pessimistic and they are not optimistic about the profitability, then they will invest less, and so investment will fall. Political stability is again an important factor that affects investment. If there is political stability in a country, then it means policies will also continue and policies will also be stable, and businessmen feel comfortable when political stability is there because they are sure about the policies of current government, and they are also sure that these policies will continue for the future, so they would be more comfortable in investing such country, so investment will rise. On the other hand, if there is political instability, because businessmen are always reluctant to invest into the new ventures because they think that new government may have new policies, so it may lead to harm their businesses, so they tend to invest less amount of money. Government expenditure is another component of aggregate demand, and government expenditure are all kind of expenses which are incurred by the government, and government expenditure are divided into mainly two types. One is current expenditure and the other one is capital expenditure. Current expenditure are those which are incurred on routine basis, like salary payments of government staff, repair and maintenance of public and merit goods, while capital expenditure are also known as development expenditure, and development expenditure are incurred on long-term projects like construction of national highway, construction of motorway, colleges, universities, schools, and flood defense system. These are the expenditure which are long term, and they are the part of capital expenditure of the government. Capital expenditure are also known as development expenditure. Capital expenditure is the factor that not only affects aggregate demand, but it is the common factor which also affects aggregate supply as well. Now coming to X minus M. X stands for exports, and exports refers to selling of goods and services to other countries, and exports are divided into two types. One is visible export and the other one is invisible export. Visible exports mean all kind of exports which are made in the form of visible goods. Like if a country exports cars to another country or exports electronic products to another country, then it will be treated as visible export, and it will be treated as visible export for the selling country and visible import for the buying country or importing country. Invisible exports mean exports of services or selling services to another country, and if one country is selling its services to another country, then it will be export for the selling country and it will be import for the buying country. So exports and imports can be visible as well as invisible. Exports mean selling to some other country and imports mean buying from another country. So all of these components collectively affect aggregate demand. If these components increase, then aggregate demand will increase, and if these components fall, then aggregate demand will fall. Now coming to the shape of aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand curve is just like a normal demand curve which we already discussed in microeconomics. We show real GDP on x-axis, we show price level on y-axis. Aggregate demand is negatively sloped, showing negative relationship between price level and real GDP. When price level is, let's say, P, real GDP is Y. If price level falls from P to P1, real GDP will rise from Y to Y1. It shows movement along the same aggregate demand curve. Whenever there is change in price, it shows movement along the same aggregate demand curve. Another reason for movement along the same aggregate demand curve is shift in aggregate supply curve. If there is any change in any factor that affects or shifts aggregate supply curve, then that factor will also cause movement along the same aggregate demand curve. I will further explain this concept of movement along the same curve, which is caused by shifts in aggregate supply, after discussion of equilibrium in macroeconomy. So you are advised to watch the video that is relevant to equilibrium in macroeconomy and changes in equilibrium in macroeconomy. Now coming to the shifts in aggregate demand curve. Shift in aggregate demand curve is caused by multiple factors, and all those factors which we call components of aggregate demand, like consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports, all these factors shift demand curve. Shift aggregate demand curve to the right if there is rise in aggregate demand, and shift aggregate demand curve to the left if there is fall in aggregate demand. If these components are increasing or there is net positive change in these components, then aggregate demand will rise and aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And if there is net negative change in these factors, what does this mean? This means some variables might be rising and some might be falling. If overall net impact is negative, then it means aggregate demand will fall and aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So change in consumption, rise in investment, rise in government expenditure and net exports will definitely shift aggregate demand curve to the right, and fall in these components will shift aggregate demand to the left.